you haven't met. Well, we haven't met either. But this is Kaia. We do this newspaper together, and as I said, we divided the labor in that way that Kaia focused on your book, and I read your articles, and most of the focus will be on the book, so it will be mostly Kaia asking the questions, but I'll tune in as a case as the opportunity presents itself. But so please, Kaia, start with your questions then.
Yes, I start from myself that explaining very briefly that I haven't been very much passionate of feminist topics since I listened your discussion with Paul Kingsnorth. This the war on reality, and I must say that it touched me very much, and especially the point when you described that your turn to feminism enlarged or changed when you became a mother. And after that, I found your book, this Feminism Against Progress, which is really brilliant reading. I'm so much keen in it. And I just wanted to, for our readers, could you briefly tell your personal story as you describe in your book? How has been your lifelong interest to feminism? How this journey has been?
The story I told in the book, I mean, how to summarize briefly, the story I told in the book was roughly like this. I first started thinking about the question of men and women and politics when I think I was about 12 or thereabouts. I had two brothers, still do have two brothers, and my dad. My parents were sort of fairly traditional, I suppose, but 20th century, she was a homemaker, he worked. When I got to about 12, I started to notice that every time we had a family meal, which was every evening and sometimes more often, my mum would make the food and she'd set the table, and then everybody would eat, and then everybody would leave the table, or rather, my dad would get up and leave the table, leave her to clear everything away, and after a while, my brothers started to copy her. And I remember this was kind of a head scratcher for me, because it was the first time I was really not sure how to respond, and it left me with a sort of a question of, I suppose, divided loyalties, or a question of where I stood in relation to his decision. Because on the one hand, he'd always treated me as in no way less deserving of status or regard or respect or appreciation than either of my brothers. He treated us all very much the same. But if I got up and left with my brothers and asserted my parity to them on the same terms as my brothers, then I'd just be leaving my mum to do the dishes, which seemed unfair on her. And if I stayed to clear the dishes with her, then I was accepting in principle that I was one of this secondary class of people whose job it was to clear up after the real people. And I just didn't know what to do with that dilemma. I mean, in a sense, there's the entirety of feminism from the industrial age onwards, just in that vignette. But I mean, I still don't really know the answer to it, or rather, the rest of a whole sort of tranche of my reading and inquiry since then has been trying to understand what to make of that question. But that was my entry point into what I actually fairly swiftly discovered as quite an enormous body of feminist writing and thinking on this and on related topics. I think the first feminist writer I ever engaged with was Simone de Beauvoir. I found a copy of The Second Sex in a secondhand bookshop. I just stumbled on it. I think I've still got the same copy. I can remember the smell of it, even that particular book. And that's that. It just started a very long stretch of reading and thinking, and some of it, very, very ambivalent thinking about what it meant to be female in a world that seemed to construct us as secondary or as sort of ancillary support humans, and sometimes very angry and resentful thinking, and sometimes, I ran the gamut of the various sort of waves of feminism from de Beauvoir onwards. And by the time I left university, sort of fast forwarding about 10 years, I suppose, from the original dilemma, I was a fully paid up sort of queer theory respecting Judith Butlerite, having sort of speed run a century or so of feminist thinking in between, and I mean, and this all coincided with really the digital revolution in its sort of mass adoption form from the early noughts onwards. I spent a lot of time on the internet. I was extremely online. Spent a lot of time on the internet, and yeah, I suppose that dovetailed with the post-structuralist thinking, in that up to that point, the women's movement had always been, in a sense, constrained by materiality, or rather, over the course of the history of the women's movement, it had become less and less constrained by materiality as various technologies moved in to plug the gaps. Although I don't know that I would have framed it in this way at the time. But the point where it became possible to be a self on the internet was the point where it first came to seem plausibly that in fact we could just unsex ourselves altogether, or make sex a completely optional or self-constructed thing. So I mean, the promise, the sort of Butlerite promise, really made sense, or seemed to make sense in that context. And I was just really pleased. I was really delighted by that prospect. I mean, I don't know that I was ever completely convinced, but I wanted to see if it was true. I was like, these people are making this assertion that actually reality is a lot more malleable than I was raised to think it is. That all of what we are or could be or construct ourselves as or are constructed by through the social environment is much more malleable and flexible than we're ever told it is. So I just want to play with that, and I think I spent a lot of my sort of experimental, vaguely avant-garde-ish 20s was really about grappling with the question of is it true that what you believe is what is? Is it true that that you really can rewrite reality in according to your own wishes, and if so, what are the implications for all of the things which I don't like about being a woman? So that was that sort of took me to the dark heart of the post-structuralist project, I guess. Anyway, long story short, it all kind of blew up in my face. It all went horribly wrong. My startup fell apart. All my friendships fell apart. I began to feel like that way of doing things was just delivering diminishing returns. Every iteration of the house shares that I lived in seemed to be more unfriendly and more just depressing. And I just started to feel like I was spinning my wheels in the mud and just not really getting anywhere. And yeah, I mean, it all sort of crashed in the same year as the global financial crash, which I think was the point at which the whole developed world stopped pretending we could defy gravity, right. Or at least, and actually, I think and for me that it's always felt as though there's a powerful analogy between the what you believe is what is that I was living out at a personal level, and the what you believe is what is that was happening at scale in the financial system.
Right.
I remember having a conversation with a friend who I'd known from Oxford. He was a maths PhD when I was an undergraduate there, and he'd gone off into the city to the financial sector, and he was working as a quant in some trading firm. I'm making fids and fids and fids and fids and fids of money, just hand over fist, absolutely raking it in. And I remember running into him at a friend's wedding a few years later and saying, I remember when he started doing this, I can't remember why I was reading about credit derivative swaps, but I was, because I was reading weird stuff. And I was reading, and I'm like, this isn't about, I don't know, 2005 or something like that. I was reading all this stuff about credit derivative swaps and how much money people were making of it. And I was like, but nobody's making anything. Like, how is this real? How is any of this money actually real? Because nobody's making anything. It's not grounded anywhere. It's just pure idea. This is a scam. And that was my very strong feeling, that this is just a scam. And I put it to Tom when I saw him at a party or somebody's house or something. I was like, Tom, I've been reading up on your credit derivative swaps. This is bollocks. What is this? Like, no, this isn't real. Mary, he said, you don't understand anything about international finance. Sort of, brushed me off very condescendingly. And I thought, maybe I don't know. And then I ran into him again about 5 years after that at a friend's wedding on the other side of the country. and I'd completely forgotten about this, and he said to me, "You know what, Mary, you were right. It was all completely made up." I mean, of course, by then he'd made his fids and fids of money, and bought his house and was doing very nicely, thank you. In fact, and I was still a kind of penniless sort of cultural outsider. So I don't know which one of us was more right. I don't know, but that's my story about what you believe is what is, and what happens, and what that is at scale. Anyway, I mean, and this was how I ended up just kind of falling apart completely in 2008. And by the time I recovered from that, I mean, it was really devastating. It's sort of difficult to. It was like a sort of epistemological and social and financial just total dissolution for me. Everything collapsed at once, and then the world seemed to be falling apart, and politics was falling apart, and there was Occupy Wall Street, and there was bailing out the banks, and then shortly after that there was the Eurozone crisis, and it just felt as though the world had ended for me in some way, and like nothing, everything which had felt a bit fake before, but I'd sort of gone along with, because maybe other people were right. I was like, well, no, actually, maybe this is all just fake, and I was pretty. But I left London. I just didn't want to be part of any of that anymore. I left the whole sort of smug kind of social enterprise startup scene that I'd been involved in. I just ditched my whole social and professional circle, and tried to mend my broken heart, all sorts of different ways. In the course, I mean, I was mercifully and blessedly around the same time I met my husband, and he was pretty much the only beacon of sanity in the whole thing. And with his encouragement, I retrained, and I got myself a proper job and just kind of set about trying to be normal. I decided, well, all of that weird experimental stuff clearly doesn't work, so I'm just going to be normal. Level best to be just a normal person, and leave London, get a proper job, just lead a normal life, being a normal person, doing normal things. So that's what I did. I mean, fast forward but by the time I was about 35, we'd bought we had a lovely house we were renovating, and shortly after that, I had my daughter, and that made me even more normal. That was really nice. That was, I think this is all a very lengthy preamble to how I kind of, because I mean I've been pulling apart, trying to pull apart all of the postmodernist and the post-structuralist and the various kind of leftist beliefs that I'd had up to that point. But it was really having a child which grounded me in a way that nothing else had, because I mean, there's no more immediate way really of being confronted with you specifically being female than having a kid. Mm-hmm. And it had always, being a woman had always felt like it was a kind of slightly an intellectual proposition to me. I think that probably tells you more about me and my personality than anything else. But that's just, I don't know. It had always felt a bit abstract to me, and like something that was more about how other people saw me than anything very concrete. But obviously having becoming pregnant and then growing another human in your literal viscera just completely changes that. And also becoming a mum totally rewires your brain. It took me, I mean, it literally does that. This is very well documented. It wasn't just me, but it was a pretty radical kind of cognitive shift for me, because I'm so away with the so bookish and so away with the fairies, that having to come right down into my body like that, and to be attuned to another completely dependent little person like that all the time, it was a sort of huge kind of screeching cognitive U-turn for me. And I probably struggled with it in some ways. I mean, I wouldn't have developed such elaborate theories about it, I suppose, if I hadn't had a lot to make sense with. Had a lot to make sense of. But it also really made me rethink a lot of the received ideas that I'd kind of absorbed from the second wave, about what constitutes privilege and what constitutes oppression, and what's actually going on in those family relations, which are analysed normatively within second wave feminism in a particular way, and the home isn't really, it's not really thought of as a site of good things in its own right. It's more of a place to escape from, or it's at best it's somewhere you start. It's not somewhere you end up, except in a disappointed or a stifled or suffocated sense. The narrative always moves away from the home into, question mark. And yet, I'd done everything. I'd done it all the other way around. I'd run that narrative completely backwards, and here I was, having done various shit jobs and been shit at all of them. I choose my word choose that word advisedly. I was functionally unemployable by the time I became a mother. I was just, anyone with even a modicum of experience in hiring people would have looked at my CV and gone, right, exactly. And when our daughter got to sort of 2 or there, well, when she got to 1, all the people I'd had a baby around concurrently with started going back to work, and I was surprised by how ambivalent they all seemed about it, because it had always, I'd always internalized this idea that going back to work is, that's the point you look forward to after your year of imprisonment with a baby. That wasn't really how people seemed to feel about it. And it wasn't at all how I felt about it either. I was having quite a nice time. She still seemed very tiny, and it seemed ridiculous that, somebody that you'd be putting such a tiny baby into third party care and going off to do, I don't know, like push paper around a desk. And also, like, I'd had enough experience as a working adult to know that most work is actually objectively pretty boring. Most of it's most office work is just dull as anything. So, and I mean, sure, being around a very small baby can often be quite boring as well. Let's not beat around the bush. But I mean, you weigh the two up, and one of them's boring and you're not your own boss, and the other one is boring sometimes and you are your own boss. And also babies are cuter than your boss. So I mean, I don't know. So that was a head scratcher. And then, my husband asked me, do you want to go back to work, Mary? And I was like, no, not really. Not, to be honest. I can't think of anything else. I couldn't think of anything I wanted to do enough to warrant being away from my daughter for however many hours a day. It just didn't. I couldn't think of anything that was sufficiently appealing to be a serious competitor for my attention with my daughter. And I know, it's not the same for all mums. Some women have careers that they're really passionate about. And I think that's a different calculus then, and a much more challenging one. But for me, it was very straightforward. I'd been terrible at every job I'd done up until that point. And there was literally nothing I could have imagined wanting to do. I certainly didn't want to go and push papers around some office in a job that I wasn't even very interested in, and pay somebody else to look after my daughter. That just seemed nuts. So I didn't. And that again was a head scratcher, because I'd always thought up to that point that being a stay-at-home mum was just the worst possible fate that could ever befall someone. And at that point, I realized having the choice made me extraordinarily privileged in the context of the 21st century. Perhaps it's a different picture altogether when it's normative for mothers not to work. But once it's normative for mothers to work, whether they want to or not, because otherwise, because the alternative is, I don't know, you have to sell the house. And actually you don't want to go and do your shit job because you don't like your boss, and it's boring, and you miss your baby, and yet you have to, because otherwise the house gets repossessed. I'm like, okay, so how liberating is that actually? And then what about the mothers who have to put their babies into childcare at 3 months or whatever, and then go and work in Tesco's because the alternative is you don't even have a place to live? How is that really that liberating? I don't know. I thought, this is all kind of more complicated than I was raised to think it was, or certainly it's more complicated than the second wave feminist literature that I'd. And I mean, yes, you can probably, there are academic experts in the second wave feminist literature who will point to and say, look, and they write about that here and they write about that here, and of course all of those conversations were already being had. And as I started to think about these issues, I began to realize that, yes, actually, all of these conversations about the impossibility of trading off care against economic emancipation, all those conversations were in fact already had. And people have been making the case for, greater society-wide valorization of care all the way through. And women make that case again, especially mothers make that case again and again and again. And yet, again and again and again, mothers in particular somehow find ourselves disappeared from feminism. It just keeps happening. And I just went down the rabbit hole and started asking that question: why is it that we have this blind spot? Why is it that we have a mother-shaped blind spot in the women's movement? Because it suddenly, it struck me. I mean, maternalist feminism has always been there. It wasn't as though I just discovered the Rosetta Stone or something. I hadn't, there I was feeling like I just discovered Atlantis. And there are zillions of feminist writers and thinkers and just women who've grappled with these questions before, and yet somehow they just keep coming back. I mean, I dare say my book will disappear and be memory hold alongside all of the others, and we'll still be having this stupid argument in 200 years' time. But maybe we won't. I don't know. Anyway, so and once I started trying to think all of that through. Anyway, the eventual upshot of my research was coming to the conclusion that that we were looking at what the women's movement was kind of wrong. That it wasn't evidence of some sort of never-ending arc of progress, and that we'd just been terribly unenlightened up until the beginning of modernity, and then we'd invented feminism in tandem with industrial machinery and so on, and that was all just objectively better than the Middle Ages. It was that the women's movement was an effect of it was a byproduct or an effect or a side effect of the Industrial Revolution. And I guess this is it's a slightly crypto-Marxist way of looking at it, or at least it borrows heavily from Marxian, I suppose. I'm not a particularly deeply read thinker on Marxian theory, but it seemed to me that looking at these questions through the lens of material relations just offers a lot of explanatory power when you think about what family dynamics are like, and when you think about what happened in industrialization, it completely changed the way families were organized. I suppose, but more than Marx, really, I drew on Ivan Illich to help me clarify my thinking about this. I'm sure you're familiar with his work. His book Gender, which he got very, very resoundingly cancelled for, I think, when he wrote it in the 1980s. But which is it's a superbly different way of thinking about what's going on with the transition to modernity. And I don't know. I guess if I set out to do anything with Feminism Against Progress, it was to update Illich's book on gender for the digital age. All I'm really doing in the whole book is writing it from the perspective of a mother and extending the argument into another tech transition further on. Sorry, I've knackered my shoulder. I'm trying to work a knot out of it. This is why I said don't record it, because I'm just too weird and twitchy today. Anyway, yeah. So industrialization. Up to that point, we'd had productive households, or rather, the main economic unit was the household. It wasn't as in the modern age, where the primary economic unit is an individual person now. We all have our own tax codes. Each person is thought of as a productive working adult in their own right, as a sort of individual atom, and in aggregate, these atoms make up something called the economy. We're political atoms, we're economic atoms, and those forms of atomhood are supposed to coincide with our atomized selfhood as well, and those various kinds of atomness kind of stack on top of one another and make up what an individual self is under modernity. But it wasn't like that in the Middle Ages, not really. People didn't think of themselves as separate atoms in the same way at all. And the central political unit and really economic unit as well, for the most part, was households, which is just really difficult to grok from a modernist point of view, because it's just hard to think. I think we struggle much more to think corporately now, or at least what the medievals would have called corporately. People as parts of a whole, as it were. But in the pre-modern world, the primary economic and political unit was a household, and women worked in the context of that household. There was no question of balancing work and home, or one person was productive and the other person was dependent. Everybody worked because most of the work was subsistence work, which didn't happen within the context of market society. Most of the work was producing raw materials, or making things, or processing materials into stuff for the family, or trading some and producing and using other stuff for subsistence. And I quoted a really nice medieval poem in the book, where a medieval homestead wife is having an argument with her husband about which of them works harder. And he moans about having to spend all day behind the plough, and she moans about all of the other things she has to do. And when I get up there, I have to milk the cow, and I have to feed the animals, and then I have to hoe the vegetable patch, and then I have to do this, and I have to do that, and I do all of it with various children hanging around my ankles. And also I have to do all of that and not burn the porridge, because otherwise you're going to be real grumpy when you get up. And she goes on and on like this. And it's clear she's not sitting around twiddling her thumbs. She's busy all day. And this is, so that's what pre-industrial subsistence household mother's life looked like. But very clearly, she's not economically dependent. She's not economically passive. But after industrialization took most of that subsistence work out of the home and into factories and more centralized kind of third-party market-based economies, most of that women's work disappeared. But either the problem or the benefit, or anyway, the challenge for women was that all the work disappeared from the home except the looking after kids bit, because you couldn't, except the looking after kids bit, and that just created, and that really set the stage for the entirety of feminism up to the middle of the 1960s, because all the first wave, all of the early women's movement was about responding to that. Are we making the case for the ongoing value of women's work in the home, absent all of that productive household stuff? And that's where you get the cult of domesticity, so called, where there's a huge body of 19th century women's writing, which is all about making the case for women in the home, as a bourgeois domestic mother. Without all of that homestead stuff, without all the cow milking and the butter churning and what have you, and saying no, actually this stuff is still important. This stuff is still valuable, and should be elevated and treated as morally worthwhile, and not just kind of marginalized. Which to me seems straightforwardly a sort of maternalist feminist project. And actually, a lot of those cult of domesticity women saw themselves very much in maternalist terms. I think their version of maternalism doesn't read if you look at it through a progressive lens, it doesn't read as feminism. But if you take those goggles off, it's very straightforwardly a feminist project. They worked on poor relief, they worked on rescuing women from prostitution. They were various moral reform projects, family support, hygiene in the home, parenting classes, cookery classes. They had hugely well worked out and networked and institutionalized social reform projects going on, which they saw straightforwardly as the political expression of motherliness. Really, I don't know how it is where you are, but in the UK, the majority of what later got nationalised as the welfare state originated with 19th century maternalist social reform. It's a whole sort of invisible history. Most of those women they've been very marginalised in the history of the institutions they created, or kind of whitewashed because their views are now considered problematic or whatever. Anyway, sorry, this is a digression. I'm sort of rambling on. Go on.
We have just reached to the second very important point from industrialization you talked about, but the second milestone is the sex revolution.
Yes, I was coming to that.
Okay, yeah. But the house is baby abortion is hot topic again nowadays. So it's just, but the shift what this baby bill has made is.
Yes. Okay. So I mean, my thesis there is that the industrial revolution, it drained work out of the home. It was a tech transition which set off a transformation in family relations. And I suppose where I've developed on Illich's arguments about what happened downstream of the Industrial Revolution was to make the case that the contraceptive pill was a tech transition every bit as consequential as the industrial one, which turns the same logic of technologization from the world outside us to our own bodies.
Right.
And that women are really ground zero for the industrialization of ourselves. And that the first mass adoption product or technology that we use to begin industrializing ourselves, industrializing our own bodies, was the contraceptive pill. And that it follows within the same logic of liberation and capture as every other technological innovation up to that point, in that it promises to dissolve what had previously seemed like an unbreakable limit, of a physical limit or a physiological limit in this case. Specifically in this case, the asymmetry in sex roles between men and women. It promises to liberate us from that asymmetry and to get rid of a limit which had previously existed fairly powerfully and compellingly on women's freedom, fundamentally, to behave, sexually as promiscuously as men. But in the process of liberating us in that way, my argument in the book is that it doesn't just liberate us to a sort of utopian, you can just do as you want. What in practice it does is just reorders us to the market. Now, whatever it is that gets liberated from socially imposed limits is not liberated in some absolute sense. It's just reordered to the market. Right. And I've drawn various. I've offered various examples of this in the book, but actually, I think the pill is probably we're 50 years into that revolution now, and it's fairly easy to see that dynamic at work. I mean, I wanted to make it. This isn't just a straightforward project of condemning the contraceptive pill, because it really is an ambivalent thing. There are a huge number of positives about about flattening that reproductive difference from the perspective of at least some women. I mean, I'm a net beneficiary of it. Perhaps had I been born 100 years ago, I wouldn't have thought to go to university. Who knows? Or perhaps people would have assumed that I wouldn't be able to go, or something else would have happened to me. It liberated particularly bourgeois women to plan. And to be able to live their lives in a more predictable way, such as to be able to pursue higher education, to enter professional life, to do countless other things, and to exist in public in a more in a way, really to enter the market on the same terms as men, in a lot of very significant ways. And a lot of that stuff has been, I'm a beneficiary of that. In net, I reckon, but it also reordered our women's reproductive organism, if you like, to the market. And you see, at the same time, you see this really from the 60s onwards. The moment the pill is legalized, the women start going to university. Women also start selling themselves in greater numbers, because having liberated sex, if you like, from social governance. We're using a technology which makes it just an individual, private, ordered only to individual freedom. That opens for the first time the possibility of the libertarian defense of the porn industry, for example, or libertarian defense of the sex industry in its entirety. Because in theory, at least, what I own, if I own my own body, great, fine. That's a liberal, liberating feminist message. But if I own something, I can sell it, right? I mean. Who are you to tell me what I can or can't do with my own property? And so at the same time as those women who some women are taking their sexual autonomy and going off to find themselves in all kinds of exciting ways. Other women are taking that bodily autonomy, or having that bodily autonomy wielded over them to encourage to lure them into the porn industry. And the porn industry mushroomed from the 60s onwards, absolutely exploded, to the point where the radical feminists were already marching and demonstrating against it by the 1970s. And yet, you would have prized the contraceptives from their cold dead hands. They would have fought you tooth and nail to hang on to the contraceptives, and yet the porn industry is directly downstream of the contraceptive revolution, because it's simply not practical to commodify live sexual, effectively prostitution, which is what porn is, prostitution on camera. You just can't do it at that scale, unless it is you can radically lower the possibility of accidental pregnancy.
Right.
So, of course, those things are causally linked. And this is just only the first instance of that when we technologize ourselves, we try and liberate ourselves from our own bodies. We reorder some aspect. We reorder that by that aspect of our own bodies to the market. And I think that you can see that vividly illustrated there in the context of the contraceptive pill. In lots of benefits, also some significant downsides in terms of women's sexual access to women being bought and sold on a much larger scale than had previously been the case. And then downstream of that, you start to see the same logic being applied further and further and further particularly into the areas of sex and reproduction. I mean, with the sex industry, we have a market in sexual access to women. With big fertility, that the same logic is extended to, for example, a market in eggs, a market in sperm, a market in gestation. Some decades further on from the contraceptive revolution, we start to see the same libertarian defense as was being presented to legitimize the porn industry being extended to what is effectively people trafficking, which is gestating babies to order. And it's the same logic that says we can liberate ourselves from the limits of our human physiology, and it's acceptable. It's acceptable in the place of those social limits that we previously had on what we are or can be as humans. We're just going to reintroduce. We're going to introduce the logic of the market instead. Yeah. So, and I spoke a fair amount in the book about the relation between that and the transgender revolution, which seems to me again an extension of the logic that begins with the contraceptive pill. Well, I mean, logically, if I as a woman can legitimately get my doctor to prescribe fake hormones in order to mess around with my endocrine system so I can have casual sex, I mean, it's not massively obvious why I should be allowed to do that, and a man who wants to grow breasts and pretend to be a woman shouldn't be allowed to mess around with his endocrine system. Or once you start down the path of interrupting normal human physiology and normal kind of organismic relations in the name of personal freedom, there isn't really an end point to it. Because you've unmoored medical technology altogether from normative human health and normative human physiology, and you've simply made it subject to individual desire. And once you're there, which is really, again, it's the logic of the market. There's no obvious point where it could or should stop. Which is, yeah, it's why what begins with the contraceptive pill ends with the transhumanist revolution. Which, and I don't think I made the argument in the book, but I've subsequently made the case that really the pill was the first transhumanist technology, and that we should see the contraceptive revolution as the beginning of the transhuman era. The transhumanism isn't something scary, which is possibly in the future, and maybe we could not have it happen. Transhumanism is already here and has been for longer than I've been alive. It's just a lot more banal than we think it is.
Yeah. Ardo, would you like to have something?
Yes, if I may. I mean, to change the topic a little bit. You said that for you, 2008 was kind of structural break from your previous life, and I can well see your point. For me personally, it was 2020 was like the kind of apocalyptic event on a massive scale, and also strong causal relationship there. As I see, it's like economically 2020 was like 2008 on steroids. Could you just please? I very much like your one of the quotes that I particularly liked in your articles was that, or the notion that the COVID was like the counter salvo of the virtues against the plebeian revolutions of 2016. That kind of struck a chord with me. Could you please just ruminate on the links between 2008 and 2020? And
I'd actually, I'm going to be difficult, and I'm going to move your starting point a year earlier and
yes,
your finishing
please.
point a year later, because I actually have a thesis about this.
Yeah, please.
It's kind of it's maybe a whimsical thesis, but I hope you'll like
all
it.
the more interesting.
My thesis is that we went through a singularity moment, which is to say another moment of merging with our own technologies. I mean, I think the contraceptive pill was a singularity of sorts. That was a point where we merged with our own technologies in the 1960s. Right. We are now a contraceptive society, as sort of in aggregate. And even subcultures that don't practice that or don't use that are, in a sense, ordered in relation to a society which is contraceptive by default. And in that sense, we're sort of culturally, socially, I'd say, arguably economically also. I mean, if you removed the pill and all of the other technologies that we use in similar ways altogether, if they all just vanished overnight, it would be absolute chaos. And it would probably take, I don't know, maybe it would take 20 years. It would take at least a generation, possibly 2 generations, in order to adapt again. So in that sense, we're fairly comprehensively merged with that technology. And it's my thesis that between roughly 2007 and 2021, we went through another singularity moment like that, where we merged with our smartphones. We became a smartphone society in the same way as we're a contraceptive society.
Yeah.
So if you, I mean, in 2007, Apple launched the first iPhone.
Right.
And I think we went through a sort of roughly a 14-year interregnum where the old and the new orders existed sort of in parallel with one another, but it was the lockdowns in particular which definitively tipped the balance from being a print first to a digital first society, and we're now smartphone first. And even among those subsets of the culture, in the same way that there are Roman Catholics who don't practice contraception, there are still people who don't have smartphones, but they're not the default. Right? Yeah, the default now is that everybody has one, and I think that's and there's a great deal that flows from that in terms of how we think about what a political subject is, how we even think, what we think information is, what we think reading means, how we do politics, down to the level of what we think a person is, at absolutely incredibly fundamental levels, and it's not all bad by any means. I think it has many downsides. But I wasn't all that attached to the liberal order by then anyway. So, in some ways I'm just, it can be gone as far as I'm concerned. And there are some pluses to the new order, but there's a lot of chaos mixed in with it and some quite scary stuff as well. And yeah, I think one of the darker aspects of it, or one of the most politically fractious aspects of it, is the way it reorders power relations between symbolic and material world workers. And I think there's a great deal more politics. I expect a great deal more politics to happen on that axis. And if there's one big unknown as far as I'm concerned, I mean, this is something I've sort of been over, as you say, a few times in my writing, is that the question of who speaks for the people who still work in the real world. What is the if elites have become radically dematerialized, then who then could or would speak for people who still work and subsist largely in the real world? It's an interesting question, and I think there's a lot of what's happening in politics at the moment really goes to that. I'm sort of hesitant to spitball too much about this because so many of the obvious conclusions are just a long way out. A lot of the obvious conclusions are a long way outside the Overton window. I mean, I think liberal democracy is probably over, unless somebody finds a way to unplug the internet, which just isn't going to happen. So liberal democracy in the way that we became accustomed to it over the course of modernity is probably over. What will replace it, I don't know. But I mean, in as much as I can guess at anything, It's a return of much of kingship on a political legitimacy on a model that looks much more like pre-modern kings than that could potentially be democratically elected, but who draw their legitimacy from representing in a way which is much more medieval. And I think about figures like actually Donald Trump is probably the most obvious one, who draws his legitimacy, and who draws his legitimacy from representing a particular in a symbolic sense, as much as any one decision that he makes at the level of policy. He represents a particular American spirit. You think of the iconic image of him waving out of the McDonald's takeaway. Right. There's something going on there at the symbolic level of representation, which to me indexes more to the progresses that Elizabeth I used to make through her country. As she used to do the Queen's Progress every year and spend sort of months at a time traveling around England, just existing, so that people could see her, because visibility was a huge part of how she did governance. And there's that mode of political legitimacy through visibility and through sort of symbolic representation, I think, is a huge part of what politics looks like now, or at least one possible path that we could be taking from here. So it becomes sort of very, very larger than life and very personalistic. That's sort of one path we could take, and another possible future, which was really the COVID moment. Is that everything becomes sort of radically technocratic. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that was the COVID ideal, wasn't it? That somehow everything would be automated and everything would be just sort of touchlessly managed through, QR codes and ultra super clever data systems that would just supply everybody with everything they needed automatically without anybody ever needing to be asked. And for some people genuinely see this as a utopian vision. That this kind of touchless, universal cyborg kind of maternalism, to me actually very sinister. I think of it as very much a sort of a spirit of the devouring mother. But it's a sort of cyborg maternalism that just absorbs and suffocates and just sucks everybody into herself, so that agency, it's not even that agency is impossible, it's that it's no longer necessary. And everybody just kind of lies back in this bath of, I don't know, porn and dopamine and takeaway food, and political agency just ceases to be relevant. It's I suppose the aldous Huxley Brave New World thing, except powered by AI and and delivery and takeaway delivery robots. Mm-hmm. So that's the other sort of vision of a possible post-liberal future. And I think if I were to sketch out what the left and the right have morphed into, it's not about labor and capital anymore. It's about personalistic. It's about the king versus the swarm, I suppose. In that sense, the king versus the swarm. The king versus the technocracy. Yeah. And which version of the future are we going to get? I don't know yet. I think it might just vary depending on geography, whether people prefer to have a king or a technocracy. Mm-hmm. But one way or another, I don't know. I think we're going to end up with sort of more. I think that feels to me like the direction of travel, and in a sense the moment of the sort of 2020 to 2021 moment was when both of those visions were very tightly superimposed on one another and very sort of intensely experienced as happening simultaneously. But I suppose particularly that period between 2016 and 2021, that was when those changes really started to be felt. But I think it all began with the global financial crash. That was when the great weirding of the world began.
Yeah, Mary, I have two more questions, but we have so limited time. But maybe shortly, just you could answer. As we reached already to this cyber era, one expression in your it's even a paragraph or part in your book is meet Lego Gnosticism.
Yes.
I think that we don't have maybe time to went through it, but one specific question to me is that it seems to me that we are so materialistic, technocratic, all this world view is without transcendent. That what do you think? Where we could find this spirituality or transcendent again, because it seems to me that people yearns.
I'm actually very optimistic on that front.
Great.
No, really, I am. I mean, it's, these are dark times in a lot of ways. Absolutely. But if there's, I mean, there are lots of things that I really don't love about the digital revolution and the cyborg revolution. But one of the themes that I've been really interested in and working on since I finished Feminism Against Progress has been thinking about how the digital revolution changes the way we read and really changes the way people think. And one of my sort of working hypotheses on that front is that one of the things it does at scale is encourages people to relearn pattern recognition as a mode of cognition, and one of the downstream consequences of thinking in terms of pattern recognition, I mean, you can see why, when there's just so much information that you can't take it all in, then you have no choice but just to kind of let it wash over you and pick out patterns based on intuition, I suppose, based on you're not really quite sure what. And that's really how people just reflexively, habitually cope with the internet. And it has some negative downstream. You get some real schizos who, the whole QAnon phenomenon is downstream of that. But one of the other consequences it has is it primes people for perceiving the world in a way which at least opens space. It doesn't take people all the way there, but it opens space for being able to perceive the world of living ideas, which is to say the transcendent world, beyond that exists beyond materiality. If you're noticing, if your primary mode of cognition is not analyzing but noticing, it becomes possible, for example, to look at the natural world and to see it in terms of the metamorphosis of a plant, to engage phenomenologically with the world, in terms of development pathways, in terms of the metamorphosis of a plant, and from there being able to perceive, as it were, the whole plant in all of its forms simultaneously as a picture in your head, and not just the particular instance or perhaps its molecular structure or its causal relations to others. Or perhaps, to think in terms of evolutionary systems and the meaning-making processes of different organisms in relation to one another. All of which are, to my eye at least, I would think of as ways of directly perceiving the spiritual world, or directly perceiving what I think, perhaps more precisely the world of living ideas. I suppose it's a slightly kind of Aristotelian way of thinking about it. I don't want to. It's too late in the conversation to get into Aristotle. But I suppose I dropped that name just to say, there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of thought about all of these things that predate modernity, but we just put all of those things down because we've been looking at the world not like that for some time. And one of the things I find most interesting about the internet is that it invites us back into some of those older ways of thinking, but in a new way. And I see lots of ground for optimism in that.
Very good.
That's interesting that you brought up Aristotle, because I was when I was reading your articles, Aristotle came up in a context that if in the kind of on the onset of modern era, it was the Protestants that Catholics would try to capture Aristotle for their purposes, and that kind of tug of war around Aristotle created space for Descartes to jump in with his epistemology. That seems to me
that's right.
The COVID moment has, as you write yourself, it has destroyed this common ground on which the technocratic epistemology rests. So that was a very interesting kind of moment I took from your essays.
So I think if I'm going to predict the comeback of any great thinker from Western history in the next few decades, it's probably Aristotle. I think he's one of the greats. He's due a comeback. I think it'll be interesting.
Yeah, and now really the last question.
Maybe Thomas Aquinas as well.
That's Aristotle for the Middle Ages.
He's quite a guy.
we are a small nation and we have our own language, and we have somehow not trouble but some warnings that how to keep this mother tongue alive. That what do you think about topic of motherland? Mother tongue. You are a nation which speaks whose mother tongue is widely
global language.
Global language, yes. But
I was teasing an American friend about that actually. So there's a guy I know, an American guy was saying, oh, you know, everybody should learn to speak English. We only learn foreign languages just for fun. And I was like, and yet Americans who speak English as well as American manage to do so phenomenally well sometimes.
Right.
It's not English which is a global language. It's American. It's a different language.
okay.
If you have a close ear for, I mean, I'm nitpicking. I'm probably avoiding your question. I mean, this is a whole other topic, mother language. I mean, a language is a way of seeing. I mean, I think it's plausible that the vernacular global business English will become something like vernacular Latin was in the Middle Ages.
Right.
Eventually Pig Latin, eventually vernacular Latin devolved into multiple dialects, and from there it pluralized into several distinct languages. And it's plausible. It's plausible that English will do something similar. And we'll end up with loan words in all kinds of languages. But I don't think we're ever going to see the universal homogeneous state that Leo Strauss was so worried about. I just don't think it's going to happen, and for all sorts of complicated reasons. And when eventually the current sort of globalizing moment disintegrates back, and which arguably is already happening. Deglobalization has actually been going on since the global financial crash. And as the deglobalization continues, we'll probably see international business English starting to fragment into localized dialects of international business English, and thence just and it will end up as the equivalent of Latin loanwords in a bunch of languages. Some distant point in the future, there'll be there'll be English loanwords in all sorts of local languages. But I don't think a language is a way of seeing, and the world is too varied a place. For the same way of seeing to apply everywhere. It just doesn't. I just don't think that makes sense.
Okay, I would say that many thanks to you for your books, and I'm really got passionate.
Thank you.
About the way you are thinking.
Yeah.
It's really amazing, and your book is kind of put the topic in context, in historical context, and in wider context as well.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your essays as well. Like I've been also kind of beckoning this sea of nonsense around us. So that's like
we live in very strange times.
We do, indeed.
Yeah,
We do. So let's keep our hopes on Aristotle then, and
yeah, I'm long on Aristotle.
Yeah, so are we, and it seems like I very much liked your answer to this on the long-term consequences of internet. Seems like you're saying that this is laying a groundwork for the long overdue epistemological shift in which is.
Well, I'd say the scientific revolution happened more than a century ago, but nobody's been ready to hear it for the last century because the wider culture was just wasn't thinking in the right way. But the internet primed people for post-atomic politics and culture in a way that just the world hasn't been ready for the last century.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, right.
And I think if I have a sort of governing question for where all of my interest is at the moment, what does post-atomic politics and culture actually look like?
Right. Yeah.
People moan about atomization, but actually, atomization is the politics and culture of the atomic age. If science has already moved beyond the atomic age, then politics and culture just needs to catch up.
Physics has moved, but all other sciences are stuck in the Newtonian paradigm. That's kind of.
I know it's very very interesting, and I'm so curious as to why. I mean, this is all of my reading at the moment. This is why I'm down the Aristotle rabbit hole. In case you're wondering.
So we'll be waiting for your next essays then. With Avonlea.
They're going to get stranger and stranger. Trust me.
So we are long on you and Aristotle then. Thank you so much, and it was a pleasure to meet you and pleasure to read you.
Thank you.